The man called Riggs stood in the white sun of the proving ground. The heat came up from the packed earth in waves that warped the air, and the distant shapes of the steel targets looked like men shimmering and dying in the haze. He had been there for 3 weeks, a period of decompression they called it, a way to wash the blood from a man's mind before the next bloodletting. He raised the automatic rifle, the butt of it warm against his shoulder, and he squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked, and 1,000 yards away one of the steel men fell with a distant clang that was lost in the vastness of the dry air. He worked the bolt. He did not think about the last job or the one before it. He thought only of the rifle and the heat and the geometry of the wind. A thing to be calculated, like all things. His personal communicator chirped once, a dry insect sound in the silence. He lowered the rifle, set it on the rack, and walked to the bench where the device lay. A single encrypted line of text glowed on the small screen. The surgeon is needed in the theater. A high priority summons. He looked out across the shimmering plain. The intelligence pointed to a biological vector. Feral, aggressive, and anomalous. He felt nothing. A surgeon does not feel for the tumor. He only cuts. The transport was a black, windowless van that drove him from the sun-scorched earth of the proving ground to a nondescript warehouse in the gut of a city whose name he did not know. Inside, men in gray uniforms led him to an elevator that did not go up. It went down for a long time into the cold belly of the world. The doors opened onto a transit station of polished concrete and white light, where a silent magnetic train waited. He boarded. The train slid into a tunnel, and the world outside the window was only blackness and the reflection of his own face, a mask of indifference. He passed through 3 more checkpoints. Retinal scans that read the blood maps in his eyes, pressure plates that weighed him, a final airlock that cycled the world's air from his lungs and replaced it with the scrubbed and sterile breath of the hive. He saw the low-level technicians in their white coats scurrying in the halls, their eyes wide and their movements jerky like frightened birds. It was a sign. A bad one. He stood before the door to Director Thornton's office. It slid open without a sound. The room was a cube of white walls and gray furniture. Thornton sat behind a desk of black steel, a thin man in a perfect suit, a creature born of air conditioning and secrets. He did not look up. On the wall behind him, a large screen showed a map of the Olympic National Park, a green sprawl marked with pulsing red icons. "You're needed, Riggs," Thornton said. His voice was flat, the sound of paper. Riggs said nothing. He waited. "A lycanthrope pack. Anomalous aggression. Population has tripled in the last reporting cycle. They've breached the containment perimeter. We lost a Forest Service patrol." "Lost," Riggs said. "Cleaned," Thornton said, his eyes still on the papers before him. "Wiped from the records. Their families think they're missing. They will continue to think that." Thornton slid a datapad across the polished desk. It stopped perfectly at the edge. "Your task is a full sanitation of the designated quadrant, all hostile elements." Riggs picked up the datapad. The screen showed satellite images, thermal scans showing clusters of heat in the deep woods, seismic readings, and the last garbled reports from the patrol. A man screaming. Then a sound that was not a man. The intelligence was thin. The risk factor was high. "You'll lead Alpha 7, Thornton said. The screen on the wall changed. 4 faces appeared. Photographs from personnel files. "Jenkins, your communications and technical specialist. He talks too much. Kowalski, medic and field analyst. She's new, an idealist. That's a problem. Stone, heavy weapons support. He doesn't talk at all. That's a virtue. You are the commander. Riggs looked at the faces. Jenkins, a weak chin and nervous eyes. A liability. Kowalski, her look was too clean, too full of belief in things that did not exist in the world he walked in. A danger. Stone was a rock, a piece of granite you could build a wall from. He did not object. An order was an order. A tool does not question the hand that wields it. Thornton finally looked up. His eyes were pale and empty like holes in the snow. He was studying Riggs. It was a standard part of the briefing, a psychological assessment hidden in the cadence of the orders. But there was something else in the director's gaze today. A searching. He was searching for cracks, for burnout, for the kind of excessive cruelty that compromises the subtle aspects of a mission. Riggs's face was a stone mask. He would find nothing. There are contingencies, Thornton said. You are reminded of Omega Protocol. Should you encounter a specimen of unusual value, a specific approach is required. The details are need to know. You do not need to know. Yet. It was a flicker of suspicion in the cold machine of Riggs's mind. Unusual value meant capture, not liquidation. But the details were buried in layers of clearance he did not have. He crushed the thought. It was not his place to know. It was his place to do. I accept command, Riggs said. The words were flat and dead in the sterile room. Good, Thornton said, and looked back down at his papers. The screen behind him went blank. You are dismissed. Riggs turned and walked from the room. The door slid shut behind him, sealing him out of the world of white cubes and back into the long corridors that led to the armory, and to the war that waited in the green darkness of the north. The armory was a long concrete room that smelled of oil and cold steel. It was a cathedral of death. Racks of weapons stood in perfect rows under the hard white lights. The team was already there pulling their gear. Stone stood by a heavy machine gun, his big hands moving over the weapon with a practiced familiarity, feeding a belt of ammunition into the mechanism. The brass casings of the rounds were dull, but the tips were a bright, almost liquid silver. Riggs moved to his own station. He took up an automatic rifle, a standard model, but one he had modified himself. He worked the action. It was smooth. He checked the custom-molded grip. He loaded a magazine. The rounds were his own design, a solid silver core jacketed in copper, designed to fragment after penetration. Under the barrel he affixed a grenade launcher. The grenades were not explosive. They were filled with a pressurized gas of a chemical composition known only to the high-level chemists in the hive. He knew what it did. It attacked the unique nervous system of the lycanthrope, inducing a temporary but total paralysis. A tool for capturing a target alive, and a last resort when ammunition ran dry. He racked a pump-action shotgun and fed heavy silver slugs into the tube. For close work. Jenkins was fussing with a rack of electronics, his hands moving nervously over the secured satellite radios and personal locator beacons. He arranged motion sensors and infrared cameras in his pack, muttering to himself, a man who found comfort in machines because the world of men and beasts was too chaotic for him. Kowalski, the doctor, was laying out her medical kit on a stainless steel table, a field surgical set. Syringes of military-grade stimulants, vials of broad-spectrum antidotes that were useless against the true infection, but protocol demanded they be carried, and a set of cryogenic containers and sampling tools for biological collection. She handled the equipment with a reverence Riggs found distasteful. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a scientific fervor that had no place here. "The science of their physiology is fascinating," she said. "The cellular regeneration, the protein synthesis. If we could understand the trigger for the transformation, a reversal, a cure, might be possible. Our task is liquidation, Doctor," Riggs said, "not research. Focus on the protocol. Your job is to patch holes in your own species, not to rehabilitate another." He saw the hurt in her eyes, the frustration of an idealist meeting a wall of cold pragmatism. She was a liability. Her compassion was a vulnerability that the enemy would exploit without hesitation. He turned away from her and went back to his weapons. As he checked the 0 on his rifle's optical sight, it came for him. Not a memory, more a stain. A ghost image burned onto the back of his eyes. A flicker of a farmhouse, splintered and dark. The smell of blood and wet fur. A scream that was his own. A woman's face, pale and wide-eyed in the moonlight before it was gone. The thing that had taken her. The roaring in his ears. The feeling of his own helplessness before the rage came, and he had picked up the axe from the woodpile. The recruiters from the organization had found him sitting on the porch at dawn, covered in blood that was not his own, the axe in his lap, watching the sun come up over a world that had been forever changed. They had buried the incident, classified it, erased it, but the ghost of it lived in him, a cold spot in his soul. He blinked, and it was gone. He was back in the armory. The sight was perfectly zeroed. A man in a gray uniform entered the room. "Transport is ready. Wheels up in 5. Riggs turned to the team. He gave the final briefing, his voice a low monotone. He outlined the infiltration route, the sectors of fire, the rally points, the fallback positions. He spoke of chain of command and communication discipline. He spoke of the enemy not as a beast, but as a tactical problem to be solved through the application of superior firepower and unwavering resolve. He looked at each of them in turn. Jenkins fidgeted. Kowalski tried to still the trembling in her hands. Stone simply stared back, his face impassive, a monolith. They walked in silence through the concrete umbilical of the hive to the hangar. A black attack helicopter sat waiting, its rotors beginning to turn with a slow, heavy whump, whump, whump. It bore no markings. It was a phantom ship. The air in the hangar was thick with the smell of jet fuel and the tension of the coming hunt. Jenkins tapped a nervous rhythm on the side of his pack. Kowalski double-checked the latches on her medical case. Stone racked the charging handle on his machine gun, the sound echoing loud in the cavernous space. Riggs watched them all, his gaze a scalpel, probing for weakness. The flight was dark and loud. They sat strapped into the belly of the machine, the vibration of the rotors in their bones. Below them the lights of the city spread out like a circuit board, then fell away into the blackness of the unpeopled land. Riggs looked out the open door into the rushing dark. The wind tore at his face, but he did not blink. He was not leaving a world behind. He was simply moving from one hunting ground to another. His mind was already there, in the deep woods, walking the dark trails. He was calculating the wind, the elevation, the placement of the first shot. This was not an adventure. It was not a crusade. It was a surgical procedure. And he was the surgeon. The ropes coiled down into the pre-dawn gloom, black snakes against a gray sky. They descended one by one into the dripping quiet of the forest. The helicopter did not land. It hovered for 60 seconds, and then it was gone, the sound of its blades swallowed by the immense silence of the trees. Riggs watched it go. Then he turned to the task. They spent 20 minutes erasing the signs of their arrival, kicking dirt and leaves over the disturbed ground, scattering pine needles. It was a futile gesture, but discipline was everything. He gave the order. They moved out, single file, into the deep woods. 3 miles from the drop point, he found the spot he was looking for. A small, defensible hollow, screened by thick undergrowth and fallen logs. He ordered them to set up a temporary camp. He did not help. He walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning the trees, the ground, the sky. He placed the motion sensors himself, angling the tiny cameras toward the most likely avenues of approach. He armed the signal mines, thin tripwires nearly invisible in the low light. He took stone, and they went out on a reconnaissance patrol. The forest was old. The trees were giants, their canopy a dense roof that starved the light. The air was wet and cold and smelled of rot and pine. It did not take them long to find the first sign, a track in the soft earth by a creek bed. It was the print of a paw, but it was as large as a dinner plate, the claw marks gouged deep into the mud. Then they found more. A deer carcass, torn apart with a savage force that had snapped the spine and scattered the entrails across the mossy ground. Splintered trees where something impossibly strong had passed. Riggs knelt. He noted that the tracks were not random. They followed a clear path, a patrol route. These creatures were not just wandering. They were claiming and defending territory. This was new. The reports had always spoken of instinctual, chaotic savagery. This was something else. Back at the camp, Kowalski was at work. Under Stone's silent watch, she collected samples. A tuft of coarse gray fur snagged on a thorn bush, saliva from the tooth marks on the deer's bones, soil from the bottom of the tracks. She fed them into a portable analyzer, a small device that hummed and clicked as it worked. She muttered to herself, a stream of scientific jargon that was meaningless to Riggs. He watched her, his face showing nothing. Her work was part of the protocol, a box to be checked. But he saw the way her brow furrowed, the way she kept rerunning the analysis on the saliva sample. She was troubled. Jenkins sat by his radio, a set of headphones clamped over his ears. He kept checking the satellite link, complaining of atmospheric interference. He tried to make a joke about the local wildlife. "Maybe Bigfoot is jamming us," he said, his laugh thin and nervous. "Focus on your work, Jenkins," Riggs said, his voice low and cold, "or I will find another use for you." As bait. Jenkins went pale and turned back to his console, his hands suddenly still. The sun began to fail, the light draining from the forest like blood from a wound. Riggs sat and studied the data Kowalski had collected. He cross-referenced it with the information on his datapad. He listened to Jenkins's report of absolute radio silence from the target quadrant. Kowalski came to him, her face grim. "The saliva," she said. "There are synthetic markers in the protein structure. Complex polymers. They're not organic. Not in any natural sense. I've never seen anything like it." Riggs checked the organization's extensive database on lycanthropic biology. There was no match. The suspicion that had flickered in Thornton's office returned. A suspicion that the map they had been given was incomplete, that a key piece of the puzzle had been deliberately withheld. He pushed the thought aside. it was counterproductive. The mission was the mission. Night fell. The forest came alive with sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth, and then other sounds. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sharp crack of a heavy branch breaking in the distance. And then a howl. A long, mournful, terrifying sound that rose and fell and echoed through the giant trees. It was a sound of pure predatory hunger. The motion sensors on the perimeter chirped intermittently, reporting movement at the edge of their range, but the cameras showed only darkness. No one slept. Riggs assigned watches, but he himself remained awake, sitting with his rifle across his lap, his head cocked, listening. He was deconstructing the night, analyzing the symphony of terror, searching for a pattern. At dawn, the sounds ceased. Riggs stood and looked at the tactical map on his datapad, overlaying the patrol routes he had mapped from the tracks with the locations of the night's acoustic events. A pattern emerged, a nexus point. He pointed to a spot on the map. There, he said, an old lumber mill, next to a collapsed mine shaft. That's the lair. He turned to the others. Their faces were pale and drawn in the gray morning light. Gear up, he said. We move in 30. We go in hard and fast. Protocol cleanup. No survivors, unless Omega is activated by direct order. He chambered a round in his rifle. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet of the new day. They moved through the forest like phantoms. Riggs led, his feet making no sound on the damp earth. He read the terrain, the flow of the land, the subtle signs of passage that a normal man would never see. The air grew thick with the smell of pine and something else. A musky animal scent, the smell of the predator. He held up a hand. The team froze. He pointed to the ground. A tripwire, almost invisible, connected to a bundle of sharpened stakes in a tree overhead. A primitive but effective trap. He disarmed it. They were being watched. He knew it. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on his back. The old lumber mill was a skeleton of rotting wood and rusted metal in a clearing ahead. They were 50 yards out when the world exploded. It was not a wild, frantic charge. It was a coordinated military assault. A wave of huge, gray-furred shapes burst from the tree line to their front, a diversion drawing their fire. At the same moment, more of the creatures hit them from both flanks, appearing from the undergrowth as if they had sprung from the earth itself. Another group moved to circle behind them, to cut off their retreat. Riggs's mind, a cold tactical computer, processed the information in a microsecond. This was not the work of beasts. This was the work of trained soldiers. The clearing became a slaughterhouse. Riggs and Stone formed the core of the defense, a pivot of controlled violence. Riggs's automatic rifle spat fire, the silver-cored rounds finding their mark. Stone's heavy machine gun opened up with a deafening roar, a stream of silver death that tore through the attacking pack. The creatures were impossibly fast, impossibly strong. They closed the distance in a blur of fur and claws. Riggs saw one take 3 rounds to the chest and stumble, only to rise again, its wounds already beginning to knit together with an unnatural speed. The silver had to hit the heart, the brain, or a major artery. Anything else was just an inconvenience to them. The air filled with the shriek of ricochets, the guttural roars of the beasts, the smell of cordite and blood. A wolf thing, larger than the others, broke through their line of fire. It moved with a liquid grace, a 9-foot tall nightmare of muscle and fang. It swiped at Kowalski, its claws tearing through her body armor and deep into the flesh of her shoulder. She screamed a sharp cry of pain and surprise and went down. She tried to raise her pistol, but her arm was useless. Jenkins saw her fall. He saw the blood. The panic he had been holding back finally broke its leash. He began firing his rifle on full automatic, a wild, uncontrolled spray of bullets that went wide of the enemy and stitched a pattern in the dirt dangerously close to Stone. Jenkins. Riggs's voice was a whip crack of command. Control your fire. The word cut through the man's terror. He froze, his rifle smoking. In that moment of chaos, Riggs saw something that made the cold logic in his mind grind to a halt. 2 of the lycanthropes were dragging a fallen packmate back into the cover of the woods. They were recovering their wounded. Animals did not do that. Not even the most intelligent of them. Soldiers did. Soldiers did not leave their own behind. He filed the information away. Critical. Game-changing. The momentary lapse was all it took. Jenkins, trying to reload, had fallen a few feet behind the shrinking perimeter of the team. A shadow detached itself from the trees. Riggs saw it happen, but he was too far away, his own weapon tracking a different target. He heard Jenkins's voice in his helmet communicator, a desperate, strangled shout. "They're on me! They're—" The voice cut off, replaced by a wet, tearing sound and a single final gurgle. Then only static. Riggs did not hesitate. His face was a mask of stone. He spoke into his own communicator, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Jenkins is down. Asset lost. We are continuing the mission. All units, fall back to Rally Point Delta. Now." Kowalski, clutching her bleeding shoulder, stared at him, her eyes wide with a horror that was not just from the monsters, but from the man beside her. How could he be so cold? How could he just write a man off like a piece of broken equipment? Stone said nothing. He laid down a final burst of suppressing fire, then turned and fell back, his movements economical and precise. He understood. In this world, emotion was a luxury, a weight that would drag you down into the bloody mud and hold you there until the beasts came to tear you apart. Riggs had already erased Jenkins from the tactical equation. He was a casualty, a statistic, a ghost. The living had to keep moving. The living had to survive. The retreat was a fighting withdrawal. They moved backward through the trees, one covering the other, a slow and brutal dance of advance and retreat. Riggs led them, not back the way they had come, but on a pre-planned escape route that used the thickest parts of the forest and a shallow, rocky creek to mask their trail. The wolves pursued, their howls echoing in the woods, but their attack had lost its focus. They had drawn blood. They had tested the strength of their enemy. Now they were shadowing, herding, waiting. They reached Rally Point Delta, a small cave hidden behind a waterfall. It was a defensible position. Stone set up the machine gun at the entrance while Riggs tended to Kowalski. He cut away the shredded fabric of her uniform. The wound was deep, 4 parallel gashes that wept blood. The claws had missed the artery, but only by an inch. The risk of infection was absolute. He cleaned the wound as best he could and packed it with field dressing. He injected her with a broad-spectrum antibiotic and a powerful painkiller. Then he gave her a shot of the standard lycanthropy inhibitor, a serum he knew was little more than a placebo, a desperate hope in a syringe. He analyzed the battle. The enemy was disciplined. The enemy was tactical. The enemy recovered its fallen. This was no longer a simple sanitation mission. "We have to get back to the primary camp," Kowalski said, her voice tight with pain. "We have to call for evac. Jenkins is gone. I'm wounded." "No," Riggs said. His voice was final. "We lost one man. The mission is not compromised. It has changed. We press the advantage." "What advantage?" "We were almost wiped out." "They showed their hand," Riggs said. "They revealed a capability we did not anticipate. Information is the advantage. We are going after them." He intended to follow their trail of retreat. He needed to understand. He needed a prisoner. The Omega Protocol, once a quiet suspicion, was now a tactical imperative. Kowalski stared at him, her face a mixture of fear and disbelief. But she saw the look in his eyes and knew it was useless to argue. This man was not a soldier. He was a force of nature, an engine of pure cold will. He left them in the cave and went out alone, circling wide to pick up the trail of the retreating pack. He found it easily, a path of broken branches and churned earth. But he also found another trail, diverging from the main group. A single set of tracks. The stride was uneven. One of the creatures was wounded, lagging behind, acting as a rearguard. He returned to the cave. "We have a straggler," he told them. "Wounded. We're going to take it." He chose the location for the trap. A narrow gorge with steep rock walls, a natural choke point. There was only one way in and one way out. He laid out the plan. Stone would be the beater, circling around and making a wide, noisy approach from behind the creature, driving it toward the gorge. Riggs and the wounded Kowalski would be waiting in ambush. He armed his rifle not with lethal silver rounds, but with custom-made tranquilizer darts filled with a potent neurotoxin designed specifically for lycanthrope physiology. The plan worked perfectly. Stone, moving through the woods like a vengeful god, flushed the creature. It limped into the gorge, favoring its left leg. It was a massive beast, its gray fur matted with dark, clotted blood. It was still a thing of terror, but its movements were slower, more deliberate. Riggs had it in his sights. His finger was steady on the trigger. But the creature did not charge blindly into the trap. It stopped. It raised its head, its nostrils flaring as it tasted the air. It scanned the rock walls, its intelligent yellow eyes searching for the threat. Its movements were not entirely animal. There was a ghost of human motion in the way it shifted its weight, the way it used a large boulder for cover. It looked directly up at Riggs's hiding place. For a frozen second their eyes met, and in those inhuman glowing orbs, Riggs saw something that did not belong there. Awareness, logic, and a flicker of what looked like recognition. His finger tightened on the trigger, but he did not fire. This was not an animal. This was not a mindless monster from a fairy tale. This was a new variable, a terrifying new piece of the equation. The creature let out a low growl, but the sound was wrong. It was twisted, distorted, but beneath the bestial rumble there was the cadence of speech, a word trying to form. On the tattered remains of a combat harness still strapped to the creature's chest, Riggs saw a patch. It was faded and caked with mud, but the insignia was still visible. An alphanumeric designation from a unit he knew. A unit that had been declared lost with all hands on a mission in the Hindu Kush 3 years ago. The beast, the wolf thing, held his gaze. It was pinned in the gorge, wounded, with a rifle aimed at its heart. It did not attack. It did something else. It slowly, deliberately raised a forelimb, a paw with black claws an inch long. A fragment of a tactical glove still clung to the back of it. It touched its own chest, a gesture of stark and terrible humanity. Then it pointed the claw at Riggs. The gesture was unmistakable. "You and I." Kowalski, leaning against the rock wall beside him, her face pale from blood loss, let out a choked gasp. Stone, hidden on the opposite rim, remained silent, a statue of a man holding a machine gun. Riggs did not lower his rifle. His mind was a maelstrom of cold analysis. This was an anomaly of the highest order. This was not a creature from the bestiary of the organization's files. This was something other. He remembered the deepest, most classified addendums he had only ever glimpsed. Mentions of unstable results during early testing of the lycanthropic bioweapon, of adverse field reactions. His tactical brain, honed by years of killing, calculated the new truth. An enemy with a mind is infinitely more dangerous than an enemy with only teeth. "The markers," Kowalski whispered, her voice a reedy thread of sound. "The synthetic polymers in its genetic makeup. It's not a natural mutation. It was engineered. God help us. It was a man. He was one of us." Riggs shot her a look that was colder than the stone they hid behind, a look that commanded silence. But her words were hooks that snagged in his mind and would not let go. And the creature in the gorge tried to speak again. It strained, its massive throat convulsing. A sound tore from its lips, a rasping, broken thing that was half growl, half word. "Riggs." The name was a shard of ice in his gut. He did not recognize the voice, but the fact of it, the impossible reality of a monster speaking his name, was a shock that rippled through the foundations of his world. He did not allow it to show on his face. He processed it. It was not a trick. It was a truth so monstrous it defied belief. He knew then. The mission was a lie. Thornton had not told him everything. Thornton had known. The entire operation was an experiment, or worse, a cleanup. A way to dispose of failed projects. The cold, orderly world of protocols and execution that Riggs had built around himself began to fracture, not from a crisis of morality, but from the professional fury of being used as a blind instrument, of being deceived, of being sent into a battle without a true map of the battlefield. If this was true, then the wolves he had been hunting were not wolves at all. They were soldiers, his own kind. Twisted and remade into weapons, and then discarded when they became too difficult to control. It explained everything. Their tactics, their discipline, their desperate attempts to save their own fallen comrades. A cold, black anger began to smolder in Riggs. He had been lied to. He had been set up. He understood the Omega Protocol now. It wasn't just about capturing valuable specimens for study. It was about containing the truth. And part of that containment protocol would undoubtedly be the liquidation of any witnesses who learned too much. He looked from the creature in the gorge to the pale face of Kowalski. He thought of Stone, waiting silently on the other side. They knew now. They had seen the impossible. They were liabilities. And the organization did not tolerate liabilities. The true threat was not the beast in the ravine below. The true threat was the voice on the radio that had sent them here. The true threat was home. The static in his helmet communicator crackled to life. A voice cut through the silence of the forest. A voice that was distant and sterile and utterly without warmth. It was Director Thornton. "Alpha 7, listen up." We are tracking unsanctioned enemy activity of a high-threat classification. It has exceeded mission parameters. The operation is compromised. We are activating Protocol Scorched Earth in Quadrant Zeta 9. You have 15 minutes to evacuate to Extraction Point Epsilon 3. I repeat, 15 minutes. Acknowledge. Riggs pulled up the tactical map on his forearm display. A grid overlay appeared. He found their position. A red square pulsed around them. Quadrant Zeta 9. They were at the epicenter. Scorched Earth was a euphemism, a clean word for a dirty thing. It meant a fuel-air bomb or a low-yield tactical nuclear device. It meant the complete and total annihilation of every living thing within the designated square. They weren't being offered a rescue. They were being erased. He looked down into the gorge, at the wounded wolf thing that had once been a man. The creature stared back, its yellow eyes wide. In them, Riggs saw no malice, only a terrible, dawning understanding. It had heard the voice on the radio, too. It knew what was coming. Kowalski was shouting into her own communicator, a panicked, frantic plea for clarification, for confirmation. But there was no reply. Thornton had delivered the sentence and hung up. Stone's voice came over the channel, flat and calm. Riggs, orders? There was no dilemma. Not in the way other men might understand it. There was no moral choice to be made. There was only a tactical problem with 3 variables. 1, an order to evacuate. 2, an imminent thermobaric strike. 3, a wounded, intelligent hostile, who was now a liability, a complication, a witness who could not be allowed to survive, and a burden that would slow them down. Riggs raised his rifle. It was the one loaded with silver. He centered the sights on the creature's head. Their eyes met one last time across the space of the gorge. In that final moment, Riggs saw the humanity flare in the beast's eyes, a flicker of the soldier he had once been. A man he might have known or fought beside. It didn't matter. The protocol was absolute. Emotion was a fatal flaw in the system. Survival was the only imperative. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a flat, hard crack in the sudden silence. The silver bullet crossed the gap and struck the creature squarely between the eyes. Its massive head jerked back. It gave a single shuddering sigh, a sound almost of relief, and collapsed in a heap on the rocky floor of the gorge. It did not move again. Riggs felt nothing. Not remorse. Not satisfaction. He had simply removed an obstacle. He had balanced the equation. "Kowalski, Stone," he said into the communicator, his voice a blade. "Move. To Epsilon 3. Now." He scrambled down from his perch and grabbed Kowalski, pulling her to her feet. He slung her good arm over his shoulder and half-carried, half-dragged her into the woods. Stone fell in behind them, his heavy machine gun held at the ready, covering their retreat. They were no longer hunters. They were prey, fleeing a predator far more terrible than the one they had just killed. They ran, a desperate, lung-searing sprint through the ancient forest. Riggs did not look back. He did not need to. He could feel the countdown in his bones. The ground began to tremble. A low, deep hum vibrated up through the soles of his boots. Then, behind them, the world turned white. A silent, blinding flash that bleached the color from the forest, followed an instant later by a sound that was not a sound, but a physical blow. A monstrous, tearing roar as the very air caught fire. The shock wave hit them like a fist, throwing them to the ground. Trees 100 yards away splintered and burst into flame. The heat was a physical presence, a wave of incineration that cooked the air in their lungs. They had made it out of the kill zone, but only just. They staggered to their feet and ran on, the inferno roaring at their backs, a sun born in the heart of the earth, hungry and vast and absolute. They stumbled out of the burning woods and into a small, unnaturally clear meadow. Epsilon 3. It was not a rescue team that met them. It was a containment unit. A dozen men in heavy sealed hazardous materials suits, their faces hidden behind dark visors. They held their weapons at the ready, not in a posture of welcome, but of quarantine. Riggs and his team were not survivors to be saved. They were contaminants to be secured. They were separated immediately. Two of the faceless men forced Riggs to his knees, their movements rough and impersonal. They stripped him of his weapons, his gear, his data pad. Every piece of his life as a soldier was taken from him. They pushed him into a sterile white transport box, a coffin for the living, and the door sealed with a heavy thud. He was moved from one sterile prison to another until he found himself in an isolation cell deep within the hive. White walls, white floor, white ceiling, a light that never went out, a camera lens in the corner, a single unblinking eye. Hours passed, or maybe days. In the perpetual white light, time had no meaning. The door slid open. Director Thornton stood there, flanked by two large men in the severe gray uniforms of the Internal Security Branch. They were not guards. They were keepers. Thornton sat in a metal chair that one of the keepers placed in the center of the room. He began the debriefing. It was not a debriefing. It was an interrogation. His questions were like scalpels, precise and sharp, cutting away at the details of the mission, the tactics of the pack, the loss of Jenkins, the behavior of the anomalous specimen. Riggs gave his report. He spoke in a monotone. He presented the facts as he had observed them. The enemy's military discipline, their recovery of the wounded. He described the creature in the gorge, its attempt at communication, the unit patch, its recognition of his name. He stated that he had liquidated the target as it posed an immediate threat to their evacuation under duress. He did not mention Kowalski's theory about the synthetic genetic markers. He laid his facts on the table like cards and waited for Thornton to show his hand. Thornton listened without a flicker of expression. When Riggs was finished, the director allowed the silence to stretch. Then, a faint, cold smile touched the corners of his mouth, a smile that did not reach his eyes. Spontaneous field transformation is a known risk of the program, Riggs, he said, his voice smooth and reptilian. It is a rare but regrettable side effect of prolonged exposure to the lycanthropic agent. Some of our assets, when faced with overwhelming stress or injury, have been known to undergo irreversible changes. That specimen you encountered was one such compromised asset. A failed experiment, you might say. A loose end. As Trooper Jenkins, I'm afraid, has now become. The words were not an explanation. They were a confirmation, a cynical admission that the organization knowingly sent its soldiers into a meat grinder, fully aware that some of them would become the very monsters they were sent to hunt. The cold anger that had been smoldering in Riggs's gut now solidified into a block of black ice. He had been a tool used to destroy other broken tools. He said nothing. He showed nothing. He knew Thornton was watching him, gauging his reaction. Any sign of emotion, of moral outrage, would be logged as instability. A symptom. Given the intensity of your contact, Thornton continued, rising from his chair, and the potential volatility of the agent, you, Dr. Kowalski, and Trooper Stone must be considered compromised. You will be placed under indefinite deep medical observation. For your own safety, of course. Riggs understood the euphemism perfectly. He was no longer an asset. He was a piece of contaminated evidence. A lab rat. The door to the cell slid shut, the heavy lock engaging with a final definitive click. He was alone in the White Room, a prisoner of the very people he had served. And in the cold, silent core of his being, he felt the first faint stirrings of a change that had nothing to do with any serum, and everything to do with the beast that lives in all men when their cage is rattled. They moved him from the white cell to the medical wing. It was not a place of healing. It was a vivisection laboratory, a place of cold steel tables and humming machines and the faint antiseptic smell of pain. They strapped him to a bed, his arms and legs locked in heavy steel restraints. The examinations began. They were not examinations. They were violations. Long needles slid into his veins, drawing blood. Thicker needles punched into his hip bone, mining the marrow. A hideously long spike tapped its way into his spine to drink the fluid that bathed his nerves. He was no longer a man. He was a collection of samples. They injected him with serums. Clear liquids, blue liquids, milky white liquids. Prophylactics, they said. Diagnostic tracers, stabilizing agents. They were lies. He could feel what the chemicals were doing. They were not healing him. They were activating something, probing the dark corners of his genetics, searching for a switch. He fought back. The first time they came for him, he used the last vestiges of his training. He feigned compliance until a strap was loosened. Then he exploded in a burst of calculated violence. He broke one man's nose and dislocated another's shoulder before they swarmed him, the weight of their numbers and a heavy dose of sedatives driving him down into a black, roaring darkness. After that, he changed his tactics. He became a stone, a thing of passive resistance. He watched them, his eyes cold and empty. He memorized their faces, the routines of the guards, the sequence of the injections. He analyzed the effects of each new drug, cataloging the sensations, the flashes of heat, the strange metallic tastes. His mind was his last fortress, his last weapon. The changes began slowly, a sharpening of the senses. His hearing expanded until he could hear the frantic beat of a technician's heart on the other side of a concrete wall. The sterile air became a symphony of stinks. Fear sweat, chemical cleaners, the coppery tang of old blood in the drains. His vision sharpened until he could see the dust motes dancing in the beams of the overhead lights. And with the new senses came the rage. It would rise in him without warning, a black tide of pure homicidal fury. He fought it down, wrestling it back into its cage because he knew that was what they were waiting for. That was the data point they wanted to observe. His muscles ached with a deep, burning fire, a feeling of growth from within, as if they were tearing themselves apart and weaving themselves back together, stronger and denser than before. Sleep was no escape. It was a new kind of hell. He dreamt of running under a bone-white moon, the wind in his fur, the taste of hot blood in his mouth. He dreamt of tearing flesh from bone. He saw through walls. He heard the whisper of thoughts from the guards in the hallway. The line between the nightmare of his sleep and the nightmare of his waking life began to blur. He tried to ask about the others, about Kowalski and Stone. The orderlies and technicians were silent, their faces blank masks. But one day, as they wheeled him down a corridor for another procedure, he saw through a reinforced window into an adjacent cell. A massive figure was chained to the far wall. It was covered in coarse hair, and its face was a nightmare of animal features. But on its thick, muscled shoulder was the faded tattoo of a rockabilly pinup girl, Stone. He was roaring, a sound that was no longer human, rattling his chains. The sight confirmed everything. It sealed Riggs's fate. The experimenters saw his resistance, his body's stubborn refusal to break. They accelerated the process. The doses became larger, the injections more frequent. They were no longer probing. They were forcing the change, a brutal chemical assault on his very being. He could feel his body betraying him, the foreign architecture rising up within him, breaking down the man he had been to make room for the monster he was to become. The pain became a constant, a universe of pure agony. His bones felt as if they were being ground to powder. His skin itched and burned as if it were on fire. He felt his muscles begin to twitch and bunch in unnatural ways, his skeleton twisting under the strain. This was it. The point of no return. The cold, analytical part of his mind, the surgeon, watched with a detached horror as he lost control, piece by piece, of the machine he had inhabited for his entire life. The transformation was a symphony of breaking things. The sound of his own bones snapping and reforming into a new and terrible geometry. The tearing of skin and muscle as his frame expanded, thickened, warped. His scream of agony became a guttural howl, a sound not of this world, as his jaw elongated and his teeth became fangs. The last vestiges of the man named Riggs dissolved in a tidal wave of pain and instinct. His mind went dark. There was only the hunt, the hunger, the red rage. He awoke on a cold concrete floor. The world smelled different, a rich and complex tapestry of scents. Old blood, fear, urine, and the musk of other predators. He looked at his hands. They were not hands. They were paws, heavy and black, tipped with thick yellowed claws. He tried to speak the name that was a ghost in his mind. Riggs. A low, dangerous growl rumbled in his new chest. He was in a cage, a large pen of reinforced concrete and thick steel bars that hummed with a lethal current. He was not alone. Other creatures like him were in the pen. Some paced relentlessly back and forth, their eyes burning with a mad fire. Others sat huddled in corners, broken things staring at nothing. And in one of them, he saw a familiar, terrible shape. The bulk of the shoulders, the ghost of a tattoo on the arm. Stone. The thing that was Stone looked at him, and its eyes were the empty yellow eyes of a beast. He saw other faces he recognized from grainy file photos, from half-remembered briefings. Former assets, failed experiments, all of them here in this concrete hell. A sliver of the old Riggs, the cold analyst, survived. It was a shard of ice in the furnace of the beast's rage. It watched. It learned. This was a new battlefield with new rules. There was a hierarchy here, enforced with tooth and claw. He saw how they were fed, great slabs of raw meat thrown through a slot in the door, sparking a frenzy of snarling and fighting. He watched the men in their clean white protective suits who came to the bars to observe, to take notes on clipboards. They were no longer his superiors. They were zookeepers, and he was an animal in their zoo. Sometimes the men would enter the pen. They would fire tranquilizer darts or use long poles with electrified prods to single out one of the creatures. They would drag the sedated or stunned body out of the pen. Those ones never came back. They were being studied, dissected, used up. They were all just raw material for the organization's dark science. One day, the main gate to the pen slid open with a loud groan of metal on metal. It was not feeding time. It was not time for the scientists. A new team of men entered. They were young. They wore the same black tactical gear he had once worn. They carried the same automatic rifles, modified for silver cord rounds. Their eyes were hard and cold and empty. They had his eyes. They had not come to study. They had come to sanitize. The shooting began. There was no warning. Just the flat, hard cracks of the rifles and the wet, heavy impacts of silver bullets striking flesh and bone. He saw the thing that was stone lurch as a round took it in the chest, and then another in the head. It fell and did not move. The other creatures, his former comrades, snarled and charged or tried to flee in a blind panic. It made no difference. The young soldiers cut them down with cold, methodical efficiency. Riggs did not move. The beast in him wanted to tear and kill. But the shard of the man who remained knew it was pointless. He watched the soldiers advance, their movements practiced, their fire disciplined. And in that moment, he understood everything. There was no irony. There was no tragedy. There was only the perfect, brutal logic of the system. He had been a part of the machine, a cog. And the cog had become worn, defective. It was time for it to be replaced. The machine worked perfectly. The circle was complete. He saw one of the young soldiers raise his rifle. The black bore of the barrel a perfect circle that centered on his head. The soldier's face was a grim, determined mask. It was his own face from a lifetime ago. His last thought was not a thought at all. It was a simple, cold recognition. Protocol executed. A flash of light. Then only darkness.